Welcome to another episode of Tons Two Cents podcast. Today's episode is titled Empowering Government Teams Through Government Leadership Transitions. We'll explore strategies for building resilience, fostering open communication, and maintaining productivity during periods of change in the GovCon landscape. I'm your host, Tom Wilson, and today with us is Vanessa Zamy, president of LiberationX Contracts, who will share her insights on navigating leadership shifts effectively in government agencies. Vanessa, thanks so much for joining us here today, and say hello to our listeners, the intellectuals, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi there. Happy to be here, Ton. Yes, my name is Vanessa Zamy, and my team of trainers and experts at LiberationX Contracts really help to grow leaders and their teams, especially during transitions, okay, which we're facing a lot of during the past couple of months in the government public sector. And I've spent years working with Fortune 500 companies and agencies and small businesses, and really just passionate about this work and happy to be here as well with the intellectuals. Yes.
Our intellectuals come from many walks of life, and you're right. Now is a really good time to have this discussion about transitions with the new administration, the new year, and everything. And so this is a very timely discussion for all of us. So Vanessa, before we dive into our conversation here today, can you share a brief personal experience or a significant leadership transition that you've been through and how it impacted your team?
Yeah, well, I've been a business owner for about 6 years now as the leader. But prior to that, I was in the corporate space, working in management consulting as well as in industry at a retail company. And I can share with you an example of when leadership transition happened, but actually went right. And then a more recent example when I was working with a government agency and learned essentially and saw what happened when the leadership went wrong. So leadership going right pretty much looks like this was at a multi-billion-dollar Old Navy, and Sonia Singhal was the president of Old Navy at that time, and she had done multiple wonderful things, scaling e-commerce business, essentially expanding the business to 1,200 stores in North America, and all the things. And we as people at Old Navy, right, we rallied for her and really supported her when she then got promoted to then be the president and CEO of all of Gap Inc. So all of the brands. So essentially
Oh,
Old Navy
wow.
being $8 billion brand and then getting promoted to then serve Gap Inc. and being their president. So $15 billion and counting at that time. And it was great, right? So I say that's a transition that went well because given the work that she had done, right, the company rallied for her in terms of Old Navy employees, right? We knew how amazing she was. I remember I even got the opportunity to sit down with her. We just sat down at the cafe in the lobby and just chatted. And that was an example of how a company handles a transition well because the team rallied around them and people were clear. And when she transitioned, and then there was another person who, came on board, it was someone who was internal. So we'll talk about some more things later. But let's talk about when it goes wrong. So this was more of a recent example during this past year and ultimately my team came in at the end of it. But pretty much what happened in the beginning was that, there was an undersecretary that was newly appointed and the undersecretary was newly appointed to a department that was already sort of experiencing low morale due to the prior leader to them. And so when the undersecretary came on, there was a lot of low employee morale and low trust on both sides because what happened was the undersecretary experienced a situation where they trusted the team, but then the deliverable ended up having a whole bunch of errors and all. And at some point, then he lost trust in that team, in that agency, and it kind of just festered, for months, 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 months. And by the time, and pretty much what happened in that festering stage was that there was a lot of turnover of employees leaving. And of course, what happens when turnover happens? There's more change, there's more confusion, there's more processes being ignored. And so by the time my team came in, it was an iceberg. The ship had hit the iceberg. And so that's an example of what happens when transition goes wrong. And we'll probably dive into more details a little bit later. But ultimately, in my experience, what I find is that clear communication and a focus on the team strength and leaning in on that transparency are really vital when it comes to managing transitions and leadership transitions extremely well, right? And
Yeah.
it becomes a chance to really reassess and re-energize and come out on the other end stronger when done very well.
Yeah. Well, I think you touched on a couple of different points that are kind of universal, regardless of whether or not we're talking about a transition or organizations in general, is the importance of communication, the importance of transparency, and also the leader too. Organizations will thrive under a great leader. They can crumble under a really, horrible or a bad leader. And so a leader really does present to the organization this energy, this overall, like, I don't want to get metaphysical or philosophical on this discussion, but I think it's really important to kind of assess and be aware of or empathetic to the energy within the organization in order to really kind of do the right thing or know what to do under those circumstances. So, not everything is textbook or how you have it planned in every instance. So I think this is a good time to go into our first segment here, which is building resiliency and adaptability. And really, in today's changing GovCon space, and with the new administration, also more relevant. Is the ability to kind of adapt but remain resilient. I think is really kind of crucial for not only GovCons but government agencies in general. And as leadership kind of transition, as a transition occurs, teams often will face a lot of uncertainty, and there's going to be challenges to that can kind of impact their performance and morale. And we touched on some of that morale, challenges that you've seen in the past with your other customers. So, but let's talk about like how can agencies really kind of be proactive about building some of this resiliency within their organizations to kind of handle these transition unknowns and uncertainties? And what strategies have you found effective in fostering a culture of adaptability within the government associations?
Yes, that's a great question, Tan. How really can agencies be proactive about building resilience? And so, in an ideal world, right, you are essentially promoting from within, right? In the because it essentially you're bringing in someone who's already familiar with the culture, who's already familiar with the people, who's familiar with the ways of working. In the government side of things, though, when it comes to those officials at the highest level, we end up getting people who are coming from other organizations, right? They may still be coming from government, but a different organization, a different agency, a different office, and there tends to be sometimes a mismatch in the culture or ways of working conversations. And so when we think about resilience being needed, right, it's very much needed. And so some ways just initially that, and it might come up later in our episode, but some initial ways that teams and offices and agencies can really be more intentional about building that resilience is ultimately thinking about it as a campaign that's happening at least 6 months prior, right? So the great thing about the public sector is that for the most part, right, there's some things where emergencies happen. For the most part, when an election is going to happen, and when an official is gonna come on board, right? So you kind of have some sort of sense of a timeline. So really, in being proactive, it's how are you being transparent and communicating in advance at least 6 months prior. Now, the thing about it, unfortunately, is that you don't know who is going to end up on the other side of that election or that whatever's going to happen. But you do definitely know that there's going to be change. There's going to be some level of some change that's going to happen. And we think about how can we now in the moments of day to day where there's some urgent thing that pops up, or there's emergency happening, or the agency and office has to respond to some new thing occurring, right? Like when bird flu came about, you know what's going to happen when pandemic happened. Oh,
Yeah.
what's this? And so it's how do you manage? You help teens build resilience through how you managing those just changes that are happening even then, right? And part of managing that adaptability is having that patience as a leader, and that's one of the wonderful skills of being a leader is having that patience as a leader, because ultimately, they used to call them soft skills. They still call them soft skills, but really it's power skills. It's skills that as a leader you have that emotional intelligence, right? To sit back and be that calm in the storm type person, so
Right.
that your then staff and your team can then kind of channel some of that from you. They may still be running around, panicked. But when you are there as an anchor, as a leader in those like moments day to day, when those bigger shifts happen, such as potentially a political party all of a sudden, the opposite political party all of a sudden coming on board and taking charge, when things like that happen, they have confidence and faith in your ability to guide them through it. Because when it comes to change, I mean, change is different. I moved around a lot when I was a kid, and I still move around a lot even to this day because I travel full time for the past year and a half. And still, when I'm going to another location, there's still that little bit of fear, like, ooh, what's gonna happen on the other side? Change is one of those things where, and that's really leadership transition. Any transition is change, and we as humans are wired to fear that change a bit, but really more so we're concerned. We're concerned about the change, and so you as a leader, whether you are a GS level 10 or SES, right? You doing your part in having that patience and communicating and being that stable footing for your team goes a very long way in those moments day to day. But then that translates into when those bigger shifts and changes happen as well. It's really just
Yeah.
about creating that culture on a day to day where people can quickly adjust.
Exactly, and I think it's kind of funny because we use this term all the time, soft skills, right? It's
Mm,
and soft skills are hard to teach, but you can teach some soft skills. But I think the one thing, like you said, about change and whatnot is how leadership kind of conveys that change really
mm,
does set the tone. And again, it kind of goes back to this energy, right? So if you've got a leader who's going to be like, oh, change is coming. It's kind of like Game of Thrones, right? Winter is coming. And all you're talking about is like the doom and gloom of winter. It's like, well, change is kind of inevitable, especially when you work in the government space. Contracts end,
mm,
appointees come and go, and different things like that. And I think those of us who have weathered the storm, I think this is a really good opportunity for individuals to consider mentoring and also finding someone who is a mentor to kind of help you navigate through all of this because we all kind of process things differently. Like I love change. Like to me, it's like that's great. But I know that how I present it to certain people, I have to kind of adjust my presentation skills or adjust, how I might present a potential change because it's not going to be received well. Or I have people who are very anxiety ridden, or people who, maybe especially in a political environment as GovCon is, maybe they don't agree with the new
mm.
incoming administration. There's going to be a lot of that. But what are you going to do? How are you going to do this productively and still serve the mission of the organization? So, again, a lot of things to unpack and a lot of things that we're going to hear discuss about.